Puss in Boots: The Last Wish begins with a statement. This story is a fairy tale, and that is excessively interesting to me. The entire Shrek franchise has been built on mocking fairy tales born from a disdain of the Disney style of conventionally beautiful princesses, dastardly evil villains, and happily ever afters. It makes fun of all that, subverts your Disney-styled expectations of fairy tales. Shrek begins the first movie by literally wiping his ass with one, and we're used to Shrek's antics by now. We expect Prince Charming to be the villain rather than the hero. We expect purposefully anachronistic references and sequences set to pop songs. We expect the reinvention of fairy tale tropes to suit more modern sensibilities. We know exactly what Shrek is. We've known for over 20 years now, to the point where the most unexpected and most interesting thing that it can do is make a statement as blunt and uninteresting as this one. But what is a fairy tale? If Shrek proved anything, it's that fairy tales are actually rather difficult to precisely define. Shrek itself played pretty fast and loose with what it included in its world of fairy tales, things like nursery rhymes and Arthurian legends. Do those count as fairy tales? I mean, maybe? But Shrek always left the door open, allowing people to come to their own conclusions about whether or not it was a fairy tale. No other Shrek movie explicitly defines itself as one, at least not within the movies themselves. You can say it is or it's not, and the movie won't have an opinion either way, but The Last Wish doesn't allow that option. And it makes enough sense for it to be called a fairy tale. The premise of a cat finding himself on his last life and seeking a magic wishing star to regain the other 8 isn't unfairy tale-like necessarily. But what's so interesting to me is that aside from that opening statement, The Last Wish doesn't willingly fit into any other specific categories. It's a movie that strains against the constraints of expectation placed on it by its genre and its medium. It refuses to stick to the primarily realist animation of its predecessors, instead going for a looser and more impressionistic style. It's a kids movie that deals with some incredibly heavy topics that wouldn't typically be considered suitable for children. And while I wouldn't say the movie is truly radical in any sense, I think its palpable struggle against its own limitations is a major part of what has made it such a beloved film since its release in 2022. The tension found in the contradiction of the film's willingness to categorize itself and its unwillingness to be bound by any categories. And it's because of how it strains against limitations and seeks freedom that I think this movie would really love NordVPN. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Listen, the internet is a wonderful place. I wouldn't have a job without it, but it's also home to any number of threats to your privacy and personal data. Look at all these different things that can happen to you on the internet. There's so many of them lurking in the shadows that can leave you terrified of roaming the internet freely, but NordVPN helps to protect against those threats through features like the aptly named threat protection that keeps your computer safe from things like malware, even if you aren't connected to the VPN. It also frees you by allowing you to connect to servers in other countries and gain access to things that would otherwise be inaccessible. Interstellar is one of my favorite movies of all time, but I can't watch it on Netflix because I live in the US. So I just pop on over to a server in Germany, and what do you know, I can cry about Murph realizing her father loves her anytime I want. So if you want to be free to browse the internet how you please, you can go to nordvpn.com/StoryStreet to get a 2-year plan plus 4 free months with a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/StoryStreet to get a 2-year plan plus 4 free months. And now, to explore the contradiction at the heart of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, I want to look to the past and explore the groundwork inadvertently built for this film centuries ago. I can't talk about how The Last Wish defines itself as a fairy tale without understanding some of the history of Puss in Boots as a fairy tale, because Puss in Boots is a fairy tale. Certainly not as popular as your Cinderellas or your Snow Whites, but it is still a fairy tale with a long literary history spanning all across early modern Europe. The first written version of the story comes from an Italian writer named Giovanni Straparola in the mid-16th century, and the Grimm brothers in Germany had a version in their own collection of tales in 1812. But perhaps the most famous version of the story, and the one the Grimms probably drew from, is is the one written by French author Charles Perrault in 1697 as a part of his Mother Goose Tales. In it, a poor miller dies, and his youngest child's only inheritance is a cat. The young man laments about how he can't make his fortune with just a cat, only for the cat to use trickery, deception, and a surprising amount of threats to help him gain property, live in a castle, and marry a princess, with one of the story's morals as translated by Angela Carter reading, "A great inheritance may be a fine thing, but hard work and ingenuity will take a young man further than his father's money." Though, of course, the irony in this is that the cat, literally the young man's inheritance, is the one who did all the work. Perrault's fairy tales, including his rendition of Puss in Boots, came off the heels of an interesting little event in literary history known in English as the Quarrel of the Ancients and the Moderns, which took place during the late 17th century and of which Charles Perrault was a major player. And to grossly oversimplify for the sake of brevity, the quarrel was a debate centered around a single question: is the literature of antiquity, that being the works of the Greeks and the Romans, worth continuing to study and discuss, the side of the ancients, or has modern literature so far surpassed it that ancient literature has become irrelevant and even dangerous with all of its paganistic beliefs, the side of the moderns? And Perrault was something of a de facto leader for the modern party, even being often credited as the man who started the debate in the first place. But in 1697, King Louis XIV rather arbitrarily ended the debate in favor of the ancients, probably because he was just tired of hearing about it, if I had to guess. And Perrault's fairy tales were, to an extent, written as a reaction to this whole ordeal. In the Penguin Classics collection of his tales, Jack Zipes writes that Perrault transformed several popular folk tales with all their superstitious beliefs and magic into moralistic tales with an ironic, rational style that would appeal to children and adults and demonstrate a modern approach to literature. Zipes would also go on to write that Perrault's great accomplishments were to produce an immaculate poetic rendition of elegant fairy tales that stemmed from an oral and literary tradition, and to transform them into incisive comments about manners and mores at the time when Louis XIV's court was in decline and Louis was destroying France with his wanton wars. He appropriated folklore to refine it and shift many of the meanings to intervene in the social and political debates that pertained to the upper classes. I bring all this up to show just how much a fairy tale like Puss in Boots is linked to its historical, literary, and socio-political context. How fairy tales and folklore were reappropriated and reinvented to comment on issues and conversations of the time they were written in. Oh wait, did I say were? I mean very much still are. I mentioned Angela Carter as a translator of Perrault, but she was much more than just a translator. She was a feminist writer in the mid to late 20th century who wrote all sorts of things: novels, short stories, plays, poetry, essays. And the Penguin Classics collection of Perrault I also mentioned earlier not only used translations by Carter, the book is actually attributed to her rather than Perrault. Because as Jack Zipes writes in the introduction, Carter's Perrault is Carter's radical reappropriation of Perrault for children of the 1970s. As translator who had to respect Perrault's texts, there were limits to what she could make out of Perrault's tales, but in her own usual sublime way, she tested those limits. However, translating Perrault was not quite enough for Angela Carter, and she went on to write her own collection of fairy tales in 1979 called The Bloody Chamber, a series of radical reimaginings of classic tales like Beauty and the Beast, Little Red Riding Hood, and of course, Puss in Boots. And far from being a tale of manners and a short, ironic tale about inheritance, Carter takes the most basic tenets of the story and completely reinvents it. It is still a story about a cat helping his owner to gain fortune and a wife through trickery and deceit. But instead of being a commentary on issues of a royal court, it is a much more explicit, violent, sex-filled story about the masculine oppression of feminine sexuality. And that is obviously much more in line with the time period it was written in during the later years of second-wave feminism. To me, this is a great example of the elasticity of fairy tales. Because these stories are often built on tropes and archetypes, things like talking animals, princesses, dragons, ogres, and curses, it's so easy to find ways to reappropriate them and transform them into something completely new. And that finally brings me back around to Shrek. As funny as it may sound at first, Shrek as a franchise follows in the same literary tradition of Straparola, Perrault, Carter, the Grimm brothers, and many others. I feel like the common understanding is that fairy tales started with the Grimm brothers, then Disney made movies based on them, and then Shrek happened, and now we're here. But in reality, there is a wealth of fairy tale literature out there and a long tradition of reinventing these plots and characters. Shrek is just one of the latest examples, taking fairy tale tropes and reinventing them, reimagining them for a new time, culture, and audience as many others have done in the past. It was a response to the sanitized style of animated fairy tales popularized by Disney over the course of the 20th century. A postmodern piece that sincerity is buried underneath several onion-flavored layers of irony and defined by a mockery of the culture at the time and its own genre. And it's from that reinvention of fairy tales that Shrek's version of Puss in Boots emerges. And this version, to my knowledge, is unlike just about any other version of the character, taking more inspiration from Zorro than any fairy tale. He's a talking cat in boots who has a somewhat deceitful nature, but otherwise there are few similarities. Despite there being no Spanish versions of the story that I know of, this Puss is Spanish rather than Italian or French. He's an adventurer, a bounty hunter, and a bandit, which has no precedent in other versions. This Puss is almost a more radical reimagining of the character than even Carter's version, a reimagining that doesn't seem to take into account any other version of the character, only taking the name and a couple of traits and combining that with more contemporary references. But that is precisely my point. These fairy tales are so general and built on such broad archetypes that it's not out of the question to create such completely different versions while still retaining aspects of other versions, even if they are merely echoes. And that, finally, brings me to the Puss in Boots movies themselves. Because Perrault's version of Puss was built on Straparola's, Carter's version was built on Perrault's, Shrek's version was built more loosely on that lineage, and Puss in Boots is built on the version in Shrek. As the character goes through various different authors and places and times, the character changes through new interpretations that create new inspiration for new authors to come in and reinterpret them, and so on and so forth, until we end up here with a completely new character than the one we started with. It's almost like a literary game of telephone. And the two Puss in Boots movies themselves take two very different approaches to their respective interpretations of the character and their place in this long-standing tradition. The first movie prioritizes the Spanish adventurer aspect of the character, creating less of a fairy tale and more of a straightforward adventure movie with fairy tale theming. The fairy tale characters are there, but it takes them outside of the fairy tale genre to utilize them in new settings, have them interact with new tropes and archetypes from different genres, similarly to something like The Wolf Among Us, which takes a lot of traditional fairy tales and turns them into aspects of a hard-boiled neo-noir. But as we've talked about, the beginning of The Last Wish clearly states that it is a fairy tale, without caveat or any suggestion of irony, following more directly in that tradition of reinvention than perhaps any other movie of the series. When the film labels itself as a fairy tale, it is actively embracing the elastic nature of fairy tales. And the best way to understand how it puts that into practice is to understand how The Last Wish treats a fundamental aspect of fairy tales. Now, it seems obvious to say that characters are a fundamental aspect of fairy tales. They're a fundamental aspect of all stories, after all. But when we think of fairy tales, we often think not of plots, but of characters. Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin. Fairy tales are often incredibly character-driven. They are about characters who want something specific, and the story is them making decisions in order to achieve it. And those two things are typically the only true constants in most versions of any given story. There have been many different versions of Pinocchio since the original in 1883, and many of those stories are very different from one another, but most of them still have one thing in common: a living wooden puppet who wants to be a real boy. Cinderella is a poor girl who wants to go to the ball. The Beast is a monster who wants to become human again. Puss in Boots is a talking cat who wants to find fortune. And The Last Wish is incredibly character driven in itself. Literally, the map they use to navigate the dark forest on their way to the wishing star changes the terrain of the forest based on who's holding it. Whoever is taking the lead in navigating the world is the one who defines the world and their journey through it. The external obstacles that the characters must face are inherently linked to the characters' internal struggles. And The Last Wish has a few different fairy tale characters besides just Puss that it's reinventing. And on top of that, it is taking those characters' usual motives and reinterpreting them to suit its own thematic ends. There are 3 characters, not counting Kitty Softpaws or the 3 bears, who want to find the wishing star, and each of them has a different wish they want to make with it. And those characters are Jack Horner, Goldie, aka Goldilocks, and of course, Puss in Boots himself. The character the film takes the most license with is Jack Horner, and that's because they kind of had to. Little Jack Horner is a nursery rhyme, not a fairy tale. Conflating the two is something the Shrek franchise has done before with characters like the 3 Blind Mice and the Muffin Man, but if I'm not mistaken, Jack Horner is the first character to actually make the distinction explicitly.
Could you do the thumb thing? Like in the fairy tale?
It wasn't a fairy tale. It was only a nursery rhyme.
As such, there isn't actually much of an original want that Jack ever had. A nursery rhyme, even if one can be considered a story, is so basic that characters having more than the simplest motivations is a bit much to expect. But that's precisely what The Last Wish uses to its advantage. Jack Horner has a clear inferiority complex in regards to his status as a nursery rhyme rather than a fairy tale, and he has taken great pains to reinvent himself as a result, saying of his former self,
He was a pathetic, buttered baker's boy. Little Jack's dead. I'm Big Jack Horner.
and his wish for the star is to get all the magic in the world and not let anyone else have any. Thus, he would be the most powerful being in the world, and in his view at least, would be superior to everyone and everything because of that power. This inferiority complex is what drives the character, and is seemingly what drives his complete disregard for other people. The identity of Big Jack Horner, a ruthless and unfeeling villain, was born from his shame for how other people viewed him as Little Jack Horner. And that theme of identity is inherent to the themes of categorization and limitation. And each of these three characters are negotiating with this theme of identity and labels in their own ways, their wishes being reflective of those negotiations. Take, for example, one of my personal favorite parts of the movie, Goldie. Goldilocks and the Three Bears is probably one of the most well-known fairy tales not to be adapted by Disney into a feature film. It's a very strange story, even by fairy tale standards. A lone little girl in the forest happens upon a house where three bears live, eats their food, sits in their chairs, sleeps in their beds, complains about it, and then is discovered by the bears and is either eaten or runs away depending on the version you're reading. There's so little magic or any kind of fantasy to it aside from bears living in a house, and very little is learned by story's end other than, I guess, don't break into people's houses because they might be bears. But The Last Wish takes this somewhat odd story and turns it into legitimately one of the most inspired reinterpretations of the entire film, maybe even of the entire franchise. Goldie wasn't just some random girl who happened to be alone in the woods one day. She was an orphan searching for some kind of home, and the bears took pity on her and adopted her. And to suit the aesthetics of the rest of the film, they became a crime family, though a rather inept one overall. The only thing they really succeed in doing is shaking down an old cat lady, and they don't even do that particularly well. But they have all the stereotypical family dynamics. Goldie and Baby are siblings constantly at each other's throats. Goldie is embarrassed by Mama like a lot of daughters are of their mothers, and Papa is the archetypal father sitting in his lazy chair and not being as much a part of things as everyone else. And more than that, they clearly all do genuinely care about and love one another. Perrault even tells Goldie,
"Speaking from one orphan to another, Goldie, you won the orphan lottery."
But Goldie's wish, the thing that would make everything just right, that thing Goldilocks is infamously always searching for, is for a proper family. Not the three bears, but something else. And what's her reasoning?
Come on. You didn't think I would actually stay? I'm not a bear.
Her identity doesn't fit into this category, and so it doesn't matter how much she loves them or how much they love her. It doesn't matter how much they otherwise fit into a stereotypical family mold, because it's not just right. It's not absolutely perfect, and therefore it's not enough. The common denominator of the three primary wishes of the movie is that they are for more of what the wisher already has. Jack Horner has a ton of magical items already, but he's not satisfied with it because nothing will solve his inferiority complex but the undeniable assurance that he is superior to everyone. Goldie already has a family and a home, but she believes she has to limit herself by what is, in this case, an arbitrary category. What she has cannot be enough because it does not fit in the narrow definition of what is just right. The film is dominated by this fear of not enough, that the life we are living right now is not just right, that we are wasting it by not seeking something more, something without limits, something without judgment or shame, something perfect. And Puss in Boots himself quite literally represents that fear. Puss is on the last of his 9 lives. He has treated the first 8 with frivolity, always knowing that he had another one to use whenever the one he was on ended. But now that certainty no longer exists. If he dies again, he'll be gone for good. And that reality heralds the arrival of the wolf. Puss initially believes him to be a bounty hunter, but eventually learns that he is literally death incarnate. But whatever Puss believes him to be, it causes him to feel a fear that he is not accustomed to feeling. A kind of truly chilling anxiety and panic that overwhelms him, controls him, ruins him. And what does Puss do in response to this? He runs away. He literally buries the Puss in Boots identity by burying his clothes and allows himself to be redefined by Mama Luna, who turns him into just a normal house cat named Pickles. Not because that's what he wants, but because it's what's safest. He relinquishes any sense of agency and allows himself to be renamed and relabeled. And even though he fights against it at first, he slowly but surely becomes complacent in it, because he assumes that if he doesn't have another life to fall back on, his only option is to do what will give him the most longevity for the one he has now, even if that means completely giving up any ability to define himself. And so, of course, when he learns that the wishing star is real and there's an opportunity to find it, he goes after it. His wish for it being to regain his 9 lives, be able to go back to his life of carefree adventure and his old label as a fearless legend. That label from afar seems limitless, with no fear and the ability to survive dying, as it were. What could possibly limit him? But to be fearless, he must have his 9 lives back. One is not enough. It's too close to true death. Puss thinks there are only 2 options. Either a safe life where you have no agency and allow yourself to fit neatly into whatever box others want to put you in, or a limitless life of adventure without fear. But to talk about how wrong he is, we have to talk about a different character. Perrault is not a fairy tale character. He's not a nursery rhyme. He's never appeared in any storybook or any collection of old tales. He wasn't even in the previous movie. He is completely original to this movie right here. And he stands somewhat as a model. Out of every named character on this journey for the Wishing Star, Perrault is the only one who couldn't give less of a fuck about it. He has no wish, he has no worry, nothing in the world he could possibly want because
I already have a comfy sweater and 2 best friends. I got everything I could wish for. No magic required.
While Puss's map has areas like the Valley of Incineration to represent his fear of death, and Kitty's has areas like the Swamp of Infinite Sorrows to represent her sense of loneliness and isolation, Perrault has the Pocket Full of Posies and the Field of Quick and Easy Solutions. While the other characters' journeys are defined by their wishes and their fears of not enough, Perrault, without a wish, who believes he has more than enough for himself, could get to the star quickly and easily if he was just allowed to do it. Perrault is content. Completely and utterly content, even though he probably has the saddest story of all, being chucked into a river by his original family because they didn't want him. As Kitty says, if anyone should have a wish, it should be him, but he just doesn't. And as every other character's wish is tied to their sense of identity, it follows that Perrault's lack of a wish is tied to his surprisingly clear sense of identity, in spite of not having a real name.
I've never had a name that really stuck, you know? It belonged to me.
Perrault is just puppy in Spanish. The closest thing he has to a name is just one of the broadest categories he falls into, and yet he has a clearer and more confident sense of who he is than anyone. When Puss meets him at Mama Luna's, he's pretending to be a cat so that he can get food, but he doesn't actually think he's a cat. His self-image is solid enough to where he can be labeled as something else by others, but not lose sight of who he really is, unlike Puss. And none of this is to say that Perrault is some kind of perfect being. He's delusional in a lot of ways, giving Puss a stick sword to replace his old one that doesn't help him at all. He's small and weak and vulnerable, and that leads him to getting captured and needing to be saved on more than one occasion. Perrault is not without his limits, he just isn't particularly worried about them. He's not ashamed of them like Jack Horner is, and he's not a slave to them like Goldie is. He's aware of them, and he's fine with them, because he likes who he is, limits and all. For him, what he has and who he is enough. And that makes him particularly well suited to be there for people when they're having crises of identity themselves. One of the film's most powerful scenes comes around the halfway mark as all of the parties after the star converge and begin to fight over the map. And as Puss is about to get his hands on it, he hears a familiar whistle. Puss's heart begins to beat rapidly. He abandons the map where it lies and runs away, with Perrault noticing and following behind. Puss rushes through the forest as the world around him transforms into the face of death, watching him until he eventually falls to the ground, trying and failing to catch his breath as his heart bellows in his chest. Perrault finds him completely unresponsive and just sits with him. Lays his head on Puss's stomach, a comfortable weight, the feeling of soft fur between his fingers to help bring Puss back down to earth from his panicked state. And it's from there that Puss allows himself to be truly vulnerable and confess that he's afraid.
It's okay to be afraid.
No, not for Puss in Boots. I'm supposed to be a fearless hero, a legend. But without lives to spare, I am nothing.
And that's the heart of the matter. The label of a fearless hero, a legendary figure, seems from afar to be limitless. Puss seemed to think so, not realizing the inevitability of his death until it was right in front of his face. But even it is limiting in its own way. It disallows him from feeling fear openly or being vulnerable with other people. And refusing to feel fear means cutting yourself off from real connection with others, the way that Puss cut himself off from Kitty, because fear is inseparable from that kind of connection. And so really, he's just trading one limit for another, being fearless at the cost of experiencing true connection with others.
Was the legend so big, there was no room for anyone else?
Puss's crusade was to escape limits by escaping death. But even if he got all of his 9 lives back, he'd only be delaying the inevitable. Eventually, he would end up right back here in this very spot. He cannot choose otherwise. But he can choose to pick up his sword and face it, to fight for the life and the people he has now, limits and all. There's this quote from Guillermo del Toro from an NPR interview he did about his own fairy tale film, Pinocchio, where he responds to the question of whether or not the movie is made for children.
It is not sanitized for kids, but kids can watch it if their parents talk to them. Kids are not in a world that is incredibly complex and that poses incredibly complex questions. And we cannot childproof the outlets of the entire world. What we can do is discuss the world. Fairy tales are a rehearsal stage for kids to understand the world and families to discuss it. The fairy tales were originally not for kids. They were folk tales that were told around the fire, mostly to adults, and they reflected famine, pestilence, war that were going in the real world, and they applied them to journeys of the spirit.
The Last Wish was released in the same year as Pinocchio, even lost the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature to it, and I think it too understands this idea that Del Toro is talking about. This idea that fairy tales are journeys of the spirit interconnected with the very real struggles of everyday life during the time they were written in. But The Last Wish is much more explicitly for children than Pinocchio is, and that's a part of what it's discussing. As children grow up and begin to form their identities, figure out who they are, these labels and categories will be a major part of that journey. They'll negotiate with them, try to fit inside them, or try to push against them, but in one way or another, their identity will be formed around those labels and the expectations that come with them. They will compare themselves to others within their same category and be afraid that they're not as good. They will hold out on truly accepting their circumstances and the love around them in hopes of some nebulous concept of better. They will run away from fear and try to find a label that will leave them without limits, but they will never find it. Any of it. And as much as this has always been the case, it's never been more difficult to escape labels and comparison than in our modern age, where the chaos of humanity is on full display for us to try and bring order to, and other people's lives are presented to us for us to compare ourselves to. And as Perrault's tales were written for his moment in time, as Carter's were written for hers, perhaps that is what this fairy tale can be for this moment in time. The Last Wish, as grim as it is, faces the kids and adults who watch it with the greatest limitation of all, the one limitation that is truly inescapable, the one category we all fall into. We are mortal. And it says, yeah, it's scary to think about, to know that one day this will all be over for everybody. In a world where it is becoming increasingly harder and harder to hide our children from the realities of the world, The Last Wish just puts them on display for all to see. Anxiety, panic attacks, loneliness, crises of identity, and of course, death itself. It says that life is gonna be hard and scary, and eventually it's going to end. You don't get to choose that. But it also says something else.
You know, I've only ever had one life, but sharing it with you and Kitty has made it pretty special. Maybe one life is enough.
Puss in Boots: The Last Wish begins with a statement. This story is a fairy tale. And it would seem from a distance that by that self-categorization, it is intentionally limiting itself and what it can be. But I don't think that it is. Art is messy, people are messy, life is chaos, and categorization and labels help bring a sense of order to that chaos. But no category and no label could ever truly encapsulate the entirety of a person or an experience or a piece of art. And at their worst, labels can be limiting and harmful and a way to simply run away from the things that scare us. But I don't think that's the whole story. There are so many things we don't get to choose. The world will place labels on us that don't fit, will put us into boxes that are not just right, and death will come whether we like it or not. We will always be mortal, and in that way we will always be limited. There is no such thing as being without limitation. But perhaps the ideal is not a lack of labels or limitations that can, at their best, help us to understand who we are. Perhaps the ideal is instead the opportunity to decide for ourselves what categories we fall into when we can, to choose for ourselves what our limitations are rather than allowing others to choose for us. The movie ends with Goldie realizing that she can choose what's just right, and it can be the family and home she has right now. It ends with Puss realizing that only by accepting the limitations of his mortality can he truly be freed from its bonds. And Perrito chooses his own name because it's what his friends call him. Even though it is just puppy in Spanish and is just a marker of the category he falls into, it doesn't matter. Because for him, it's not a limitation. It's a reminder of the good that he has in his life. This story is a fairy tale. And as a fairy tale, it is able to choose its identity. It is able to take the old and make it new. It is able to reinvent characters like Jack Horner, Goldilocks, and Puss in Boots. It is able to be whatever it wants or needs to be, do what it has to do, say what it has to say, and by doing so, it is limited to what those characters are and have been. But if you just look at the history of Puss in Boots alone, you'll see those limits aren't as strict as you may think. And so when Puss in Boots The Last Wish states this story is a fairy tale, it is not limiting itself, it's freeing itself.